NASA is now laying concrete plans to set its foot on the moon again, and it has the SLS rocket to do so. They've been making plans to take this bold step, but what's been holding them are the several engineering challenges that were suddenly discovered during the wet dress rehearsal. The space company made history in 1969 when Apollo 11 sent humans to the moon. It hopes to do the same in 2025 by sending Artemis 3, launching the first woman and the first person of color to the moon. It will use a giant, under-development rocket known as the Space Launch System SLS. The SLS has a complicated design. You can be right to say that its design are more complicated than SpaceX Starship, so anytime NASA is set to do the needful of sending it to orbit, the rocket will be faced with critical component malfunctioning, and this has been what was keeping the sleeping dog in the bed. Right now, NASA is ready to get things fixed, and the SLS rocket is up and running. Today we'll discuss why NASA thinks that Starship rocket may not be lifted up from the ground to space unless the SLS rocket is ready to take off. Stay tuned to learn about the various tests and the fault NASA has fixed on the SLS rocket to prepare it for the orbital journey. On June 14, 2022, a full moon was seen from Launch Complex 39B at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, which NASA operates. On top of the mobile launcher, the Artemis 1 Space Launch System SLS and the Orion spacecraft were positioned for a wet dress rehearsal. The purpose of this rehearsal was to practice the time frames and procedures for the launch. Before sending crews to the moon, the SLS and the Orion spacecraft will be put through their various tests. The initial tests may have ended up with a couple of challenges, but NASA is ready to stay put and succeed. With the help of Artemis, NASA will prepare the groundwork for establishing a permanent base on the moon and use the moon as a stepping stone to journey to Mars, which is also SpaceX's goal. The wet dress rehearsal for Artemis 1 was closed at 7:37 p.m. on June 20, 2022 at the T29-second mark in the countdown. With this test, the crew successfully loaded all propellant tanks on the SLS rocket for the first time. It was also the first time that NASA SLS engineers would enter the terminal launch countdown. Launch controllers discovered a hydrogen leak around the fast disconnect that links an umbilical from the tail service mast on the mobile launcher to the rocket's core stage. At the same time, fuel was being put into the rocket as part of the test activities. The crew tried to rectify the leak by first heating the fast disconnect and then cooling it back down to form a seal, but their efforts were unsuccessful and the leak persisted. The launch controllers, or you can also call them launch test engineers, then devised a plan to mask the data associated with the leak, which in the event of a real launch day scenario would cause a hold to be placed on the ground launch sequencer, also known as the launch computer. This would allow the launch engineers to get as far into the countdown as possible. The time necessary to develop the strategy prompted a long pause during the launch activities associated with the countdown. Nevertheless, they were allowed to resume with the terminal count. During the terminal count, the teams carried out many essential procedures that needed to be finished before the launch. One of these was the transfer of control from the ground launch sequencer to the automated launch sequencer controlled by the rocket's flight software. This was an important step that the team wanted to complete. The teams accomplished several major goals while working inside the Vehicle Assembly Building VAB. These goals included determining the source of the leak in the liquid hydrogen system at the tail service mast umbilical, replacing the check valve and support hardware for the interim cryogenic propulsion stage gaseous helium system, and modifying the ICPS umbilical purge boots. All these were much for a launch that is supposed to start in less than 4 hours. During cryogenic operations, the extra visibility offered by hazardous gas detectors installed above the upper stage enabled better identification of any possible leaks. In order to get the crew module and launch abort system ready for rollout, the access points must be closed. Engineers put rain gutters on the crew access portion of the spacecraft to prevent moisture from entering the crew module while the spacecraft and the rocket are still at the launch pad. The teams have begun preparing the rollout arrangement of the service platforms surrounding the moon rocket and spacecraft in the VAB in preparation for the moon rocket and spacecraft's return to the launch pad. Of course, the Artemis 1 launch will be history in the making. NASA's deep space exploration systems will be tested for the first time at Kennedy Space Center. The Orion spacecraft will be launched on top of the massive SLS rocket as the first in a series of missions aimed at human deep space exploration. This uncrewed test mission will show NASA's potential to sustain human life on the moon and beyond. The SLS spacecraft is expected to go hundreds of kilometers beyond the moon during this 3-week journey. Orion, the first human-grade deep space vehicle, will spend more time in space and return to Earth faster than any previous spacecraft. NASA astronauts think that as large and daring as the SLS is, it pales compared to what Starship could do. Starship has the potential to reshape the solar system in ways beyond our understanding and completely change the game, according to Alan Stern of the Southwest Research Institute in Texas, who leads NASA's New Horizons project, which passed by Pluto in 2015. This alone makes what NASA thinks about the Starship to be void. But is it really the truth that SpaceX won't be able to reach orbit until the SLS is launched into space from the ground? Let's work out the flaws in this line of thinking. The bitter truth be told is that it depends highly on how SpaceX decides to proceed with the design of the Starship. It was recently confirmed that the SLS would not take to the skies until 2022, and now we are in 2022. NASA should start proving its capabilities to us. However, despite the immense work done on the SLS, as well as the design concepts of Boeing and other space companies, which are basically laid on a belief that says, don't launch until you know it will work, we can presume that SLS will reach orbit on its first launch. On the other hand, Starship is following SpaceX's design and testing concept of blow it up until it stopped getting burnt. This might lead to faster development, with the first Super Heavy booster flying before the end of this year. It would, however, be up to SpaceX to determine what to do with it. They could do a series of flights, like in the case of the Starship, which was propelled up to 10 or 20 kilometers and let it fall before landing. This appears to be the greatest choice because it would allow them to test more systems and increase their chances of reusing the first boosters. At the same time, they may just say, screw it, let's stack a Starship on top of the Super Heavy and launch it into space and see what happens. They could have a Starship in orbit by the end of the year if they follow this principle, but don't expect this mission to be successful since it was done out of no strategy and no concrete plan. If Starship enters orbit this year, it will very likely do nothing. It'll just be a gigantic steel tube in orbit with no ability to re-enter the atmosphere because the heat shields haven't been tested yet. There is one issue with sending the Starship into orbit this year. The Raptor engines are still rather scarce. SpaceX is making them as quickly as possible, but there are not enough for the number of Super Heavies and Starships currently on the ground. Hence, they must decide whether they would rather risk losing 36 Raptor engines just to put a Starship in a bid to be the first big guys in space and rub it in the face of NASA's SLS as a challenge, or whether they would rather risk losing the propellants just to prove to NASA that they know their business more than any other space company in the world. Because there are an unlimited number of options for what they might do with the 36 Raptor engines if they only continued with the testing that is now being conducted by SpaceX. It would be a waste to use all the 36 Raptor engines for an orbital mission which wouldn't accomplish anything in any way for now. Which space rocket would you love to see launched in space first? Is it the SLS rocket or the SpaceX Starship? Well, SpaceX is getting ready to win this race and has shown their 33 engines Starship booster monster for the first time ever. Just click on this video to know more.